welcome to Movement Not Miracles. I'm Anna from Eat, Move, Be Happy. A bit of where are we up to? It's Tuesday. I couldn't even remember what day it was. So I hope you've had a lovely weekend and are coping well during this second lockdown. Just before we start Movement Not Miracles, if anybody or you know of anybody who might need a little bit more support in just looking after their mental health and well-being over this winter lockdown period, we do run online coaching and specifically aim at some practical ways of helping people cope in this particularly difficult time. So enough about that. You can check out the website www.eatmovebehappy.com. Movement Not Miracles is all about some practical ways that you can look after your joints, look after your posture, so that we can help keep joints mobile and ward off some of those aches and pains that we can get when we stiffen up. And today is a bit of a hip fest because I'm having a few problems with stiff hips and a bit of a glute issue. So I'm indulging myself and you can join in with me. So this one is, you need to be able to, there are some things that you can do if you are seated. Particularly, there's some of the moves you need to be able to work on the floor. So apologies if that's difficult for some, but I will talk you through some of the variations that you can do if you are seated. So we're going to be working on some movement and some stretch for our hips and particularly our hip flexors, because if you find yourself sitting for a long periods of time, we're in this position. So our hip flexors, which are the muscles at the front of our hips that allow us to lift our legs up, they stay nice and short, and our hips are not designed just to move in one plane. They're a ball and socket joint, so they should move much more than typically we do. So some simple things that we can do just to encourage some more movement. Now you can do these if you are seated. So if you're sitting in a chair, sit at the edge of the chair and sitting nice and tall. So we don't want to be sitting in this position. So you might find that you end up sitting on the fleshy part of your bum and your shoulders come forward and you're sort of squashed down. That is not good for our posture. So your vertebrae can get a little bit stiff and out of alignment and things can start to ache. So we want to think about sitting nice and tall. So straight away, I'm now sitting on the bones of my bottom. So it brings my weight forwards and I'm sitting up nice and tall and my shoulders are back and down. So it's much harder to be round shouldered if we're sitting nice and tall. So think about that as a starter for 10. Now imagine I'm sitting in a chair. So obviously my knees would be bent, and staying sitting nice and tall, we're just going to hug that knee into your chest. So we're not going to flop back and bring the knee forwards. We're going to stay sitting nice and tall and bring that knee up and then work on the other side. Again, sitting nice and tall, knee up towards the chest. Now, if you are able to, if you can do this lying on the floor, you might find that you can get a little bit more movement. So one leg flat on the floor, working so that your toes are pointing up towards the ceiling, and the other leg, we're going to pull that knee towards the floor. It's a good idea to hold at the back of your thigh, and then you're not putting extra pressure on your knee joint. And just a couple of breaths to relax as you hug that knee in towards your chest, and then we'll swap over. So that straight leg, toes pointing towards the ceiling, so you're working through your quads for that to happen, and then hug this knee into your chest and hold it for, I'm going to do 5 breaths. So nice and relaxed through the rest of your body. I'm working quite hard to pull that knee in. Right, we're going to do that first side for a second time, because we all know the second time is better, and we might get a little bit more movement now that our hip has realised, this is what we're doing. Working hard through that straight leg, so pushing that straight leg into the floor, toes pointing towards the ceiling. If that leg's relaxed, you're likely your toes will fall out to the side. So we want to stabilise the hips, so working through that leg to keep that happening. Couple more breaths. Okay, one more, swap over. Knee to chest and relax through everything else. A similar sort of move, but this time, rather than pulling the knee straight up towards the chest, now we're going to pull the knee just over diagonally. So it's going to be a bit of a subtle move, because I don't want you to roll your bottom off the floor if I show you with the other side. Again, you can still do these seated, making sure you're sitting tall. We're not letting that bottom, the hip, lift up off the floor. So your bottom is staying in contact with the floor, but we're just going to move that knee across as if you're trying to pull your knee towards your opposite armpit. Now, you're not going to get a huge amount of movement, but that's okay. You're just encouraging that hip joint to move in a slightly different way than it would normally do if you're sitting in a chair, which is quite healthy for it to do. And then we're going to swap over. So knee up to the chest first, and then over to the side. Oh, apologies if you can hear my tummy. It's lunchtime and I am hungry. I'm going to do the first side for a second time. So knee up towards the chest first, and then just don't force it just until it won't go any more, but you should feel a slightly different, a stretch in a slightly different position in your hip. And then once more on this second side. This is my hip that's giving me some jip, so it's having to have a little bit of TLC, but that's okay. Okay. Then we're going to do one of my favourites, a downward dog. So this is just to get some stretch for our lower back. We will stretch through the backs of our legs and through our shoulders as well. If you are seated, then you can do this one, folding yourself forwards, taking your legs out of the equation and resting your arms onto a surface, a window ledge or a table or a work surface, making sure whatever you're resting your arms on doesn't move, so that you are nice and solid. And you can work through pushing your bottom backwards and your hands down into the surface so that you get some nice stretch through your spine. If you're with me and you're working on the floor, on all fours, tucking your toes under, and then as you lift your hips up, push back through your hands. I think you can just about see in shot, and let your head relax. So this is working through the whole of your body actually, which is why I like it so much. But if we're concentrating on lifting our hips up, we're going to get a nice stretch through our lower back and the rest of our spine. Think of squeezing your shoulder blades onto the back of your chest. Okay, and then we're going to alternate this one with child's pose. So toes together, knees apart, and we're going to flex forward from your groin area. So again, trying to keep your bottom onto your heels. So we're not bending forwards like this with a rounded back. We're thinking of sticking your bottom backwards and bringing your chest forwards and then resting your head on the floor. And try and think of keeping that bottom onto your heels. So you might need to push back on your hands to help that happen. Squeezing your shoulder blades together onto the back of your chest. So if you're trying to squash them towards the floor. And tilting that pelvis down towards your heels. Okay, we're going to take it back into downward dog. Encouraging some different movement through the hips. So you will feel a stretch down the back of the legs, and that's fine. Oh, I forgot about my elbows. Don't let your elbows bend. And then once more into child's pose. Toes together, knees apart, and bend forward. Keeping that pelvis tilted forwards, as if you're trying to curl your tailbone down towards the floor. Get some stretch in that lower back. And keep breathing. Okay. We're now just going to stretch through our inner thigh and the inner part of our hip flexors. So kneeling on the floor, my head's going to go out of shot now, but that doesn't matter because it's the lower part of me that I want you to pay attention to. So kneeling on the floor, heel in line with your knee and your hips pushed forward. So this knee stays out, we don't want this to happen. So straight away there you are working through that hip joint, through the thigh bone to keep that rotating round and keeping that knee out. So if you just poke yourself in the bottom, you should feel those muscles working behind. Keeping this kneeling leg, the muscles in that bottom pushing forward, so this hip is nice and straight, so you might feel a bit of a stretch through that front hip flexor there. So holding all of that in position, so my shoulders are square, my hips are square, and I'm going to use this butt to push my body. Now my whole of my body, I don't bend forwards and I'm not bending to the side, so my body's staying tall and I'm pushing my weight forwards towards, with that knee going towards that toe. So you should feel a nice stretch down the inside of this leg now, and you might feel a stretch through here, which is good. So keep that bottom working to push that hip forward, so tilting that pelvis forwards. And then think of, when you get to this position, this hip, push it towards the floor. Now again, it's a bit of a subtle move. You are not going to get a lot of movement. That's okay, but you should feel a bit more of a stretch through the inside of that groin as well. Okay, so we'll just relax that and we'll go on the other side. So setup is important. So hips are square, shoulders are square, nice and tall. Knee and heel in line with the knee, and that knee is back. So I'm working hard through my glutes, through the muscles in my bottom, to keep that knee and this hip supported and this hip pushing forwards. If I show you from the side on this one. So what it's really easy to be lopsided like this. So I've got, my hips are not level and my bum is sticking out. And what we want is for this glute to push that hip forward and your other glute to grip in and level off your hips and keep that knee out towards the side. So, and that stays, I'm now moving into that sideways movement. It stays all the way through. So there's a big difference to that. Hopefully you can see what I mean. You should be able to feel the muscles in your bum working with this one, as well as the stretch through the inside of your thigh there, and then when you get as far as you can go, think of pushing that groin down towards the floor and keeping your bum pushing your hips forward. So it's quite a subtle move, but it just encourages our hips to work through the inside of the groin and open up a little bit more, which they don't do when we are sitting or kneeling in this position all of the time. So certainly for me, it really helps create some space in my hips and encourage a bit more movement. Right, we're going to finish with a lunge hip flexor stretch. So it's another kneeling one. So kneeling facing forwards this time, 1 foot reasonably wide out, and it's a similar sort of thing. So we don't want our bum sticking out. So my thigh is pointing down towards the floor and my foot is flat on the floor, but I'm not working through my bottom at all. That's nice and squishy, and there's no stretch through my hip flexor, and I'm just sort of balancing here. So what we're aiming to do is push forwards through that hip. So again, you're using your bum. So the minute you engage your glutes, you get much more work through the hip here. So I can now feel this stretch into my hip flexors at the front of my hip and down into my quad. And then keeping my body upright and my hips level. Just think of moving the whole of my hips forward. The minute you bend your body, you take the stretch out of your hip flexor. You shorten that muscle, which is short if you're sitting all of the time. So think of just moving the whole of your hips forward and breathe through that stretch through your hip flexor there. It's really easy if we stay sitting for long periods of time for our hip flexors to get really short, and if that muscle gets tight because it's shortened, then it can pull on our pelvis and on our hip joint, which means that we're not going to get as much movement through our hip joint as we could, and that's when you end up with some tightness, and that's when you end up potentially just causing some minor, very minor damage to the muscles or the ligaments in your hips. So setting up on this side, bottom tucked under. Really, I can now, this is on my left side now, so I'm going to sneak that foot a little bit further forwards and then think of bringing my hips and my pelvis forwards, body stays upright. And keep breathing. If you stay relaxed everywhere else and just focus on where you want that stretch to be, and each breath, see if you can think of pushing that hip forward a little bit more. you might find you get a little bit more stretch. Okay, so hopefully your hips feel like they've got a little bit more space in them now, a little bit more movement. Sitting cross-legged, particularly if you sit cross-legged nice and tall, is nice for our hips, because again it encourages them to be in a slightly different position than we would normally be just sitting in a chair where we tend to slouch and slump. So looking after our posture and keeping our joints mobile is a really good way of preventing those aches and pains. It's much better to prevent stiffness occurring in the first place than try and work through it. I need to take some of my own medicine. Hopefully that's given you some ideas. Don't forget to check out the website www.eatmovebehappy.com. We're offering different online coaching programs at the moment to help people with eating and exercise habits look after your mental health. So if you just feel like you might need a little bit of extra help at the moment, go and check out and see what's available, or pass it on to somebody who you know that might benefit. Look after yourselves, and I will see you tomorrow.